A new front against ISIL. The US launches airstrikes against the armed group in the Libyan city of Sirte. But will airstrikes be enough? And is there a shift in American policy towards ISIL? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Story. I'm Sohail Rahman. For the past few months, Libyan forces have been engaged in a battle to push ISIL fighters out of Sirte, but progress has been slow. Now the United States military has entered the fight at the request of Libya's UN-backed unity government. US forces have begun airstrikes against ISIL targets in the coastal city. And on Tuesday, government forces said they'd taken control of Sirte's central district. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first Al Jazeera's Natasha Ghanem has the latest on the military campaign.
Libyan forces have been credited with significantly reducing the ranks of ISIL in the Mediterranean port city of Sirte. They're targeting as many as 5,000 of its fighters, who have created the largest base of operations outside Iraq. But with the battlefield on the streets in Sirte, Libya's unity government, or GNA, has asked for outside help. Enter the United States.
One of the things that we're able to do is to conduct precision airstrikes in an urban area like this, reducing the risk of civilian casualties. And clearly that was a concern on the part of the GNA. And our ability to strike with precision was a capability that they sought out.
The U.S. has been wanting to hit ISIL in Libya for some time, but the country has been contending with political turmoil and a power struggle between two rival governments. A renegade general in the eastern city of Benghazi continues an armed rebellion against the Tripoli-based government. U.S. and Libyan officials have stressed the necessity of mutual cooperation in combating a common enemy.
The goal for the GNA is to eliminate ISIL from Sirte and from the country, and we'll be working closely with them, and they'll be determining the pace and the success of this campaign.
On Monday, the Libyan prime minister met top military officials after the U.S. airstrikes. He stresses the U.S. involvement will be limited.
The operations at this stage come at a specific time frame and will not exceed the city of Sirte and its suburbs. We asked for air support from international alliances, mainly the United States. We affirm there will be no combat military presence on the ground.
The Pentagon is also emphasizing that for now, there are no plans to put American soldiers on the ground in Sirte. Natasha Ghanem, Al Jazeera.
In recent months, US-backed forces had made some gains in Sirte, but they haven't been able to take back full control. After a major offensive by pro-government forces in May, it's believed fewer than 1,000 ISIL fighters are still in Sirte. The armed group took control of Libya's port city in May last year. At one point, its self-declared caliphate stretched approximately 200 kilometres on either side of Sirte along the Mediterranean coastline. Well, time now to bring in our guests for this edition of Inside Story. In Tripoli, Salah Elbakush, political analyst and member of the negotiating team for the GNC. In Tunis, Mohamed El-Jar, non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council based in Libya. And in Arlington, Virginia, Christopher Chivis, Associate Director of the International Security and Defence Policy Centre at the RAND Corporation. Gentlemen, welcome to this edition of Inside Story. Salah Elbakush in Tripoli, can I come to you first? How important are these airstrikes at this moment militarily to the internationally recognised UN-backed government?
Well, first of all, I think the military operation launched by the GNA in May has made significant progress, as your report mentioned. However, now it is in the last few hundred yards inside the city. And these forces, they are using Second World War equipment, and they don't have the ability to manage the battlefield inside in these close quarters. Their Air Force does not have precision bombs, and their artillery is not precise. It's old equipment. So I guess the American assistance here is needed, and it will, I think, close this chapter within a few days. But additionally, I think it's the whole thing is beneficial to all parties. It provides the GNA with an opportunity to show that it can take decisive action. It also, for the Americans and the Obama administration, it's an opportunity to score a quick win. That's important, especially in this election season. And for the international community, it's an opportunity to undo the horrendous publicity following the discovery of the French connection with Haftar. This will show probably some balance. So overall, I think it's a good day yesterday.
Okay. Well, you've certainly hit on all of the sort of main topics that we're going to talk about across this half hour. Let me bring in Christopher Chivis. And of course, Salah just mentioned there, one of the most important things was about the equipment that is used on the ground and the technology that the Americans can bring to the fight. The international community is very concerned, really, isn't it, about offering the latest technology to fighters on the ground, because they don't know where this technology, i.e. the equipment, could end up after the fight is over. That would be one of the concerns for the US, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a concern in all of these situations, especially in a case like Libya, where there's so much deep political uncertainty. We have so little knowledge about so many of the groups that U.S. and French and other teams are trying to work with right now. So that's unquestionably one of the concerns. I mean, I think in this case, obviously, the use of U.S. air power has been really, really significant. It just took a long time for people to recognize that it was going to be valuable. And also, I think, for the situation to emerge in which it was going to be able to use that air power without doing any significant damage to civilians.
There have been, of course, momentary lapses in credibility, really, for the government. Mohamed El-Jar, if I can come to you in Tunis, because onlookers are wondering why it's taken so long for the government to act. And I suppose perhaps one of the issues there is that the international community, along with the new government, couldn't act too soon because the government was so fragile in the way it was formed.
Yes, there are two ways to look at this, actually. It's a Libyan perspective, and that's the GNA throughout the last few months has suffered huge losses in its battle for Sirte, or its forces. Al-Bunyan al-Marsus have suffered huge losses in terms of the numbers. More than 350 have been killed and more than 2,200 have been injured. And I think this is why we see the Government of National Accord asking for the United States' help at this point, because every single meter that they advance in Sirte comes at a huge cost. And I believe that they requested the airstrikes in order to minimize the damage that the forces of this government have sustained. But there is also the important, and we cannot ignore this, that there is the domestic politics within the United States, and that the the Democrats' administration in the White House is trying to prove that it is tough on Islamic State and that it is re-engaging with Libya just before the November elections. And I think maybe that the Government of National Accord maybe has been nudged or even pushed into choosing the time of when to request the help of the United States in particular. But I believe the concern here, what France did, or what France is doing in Libya, and what the United States is now doing, is that they are actually backing single factions within a divided country that's still yet to have a single unified and representative government in Libya. This GNA, although it is internationally recognized, but within Libya there are key factions in the country that still do not recognize this government, and I believe this could have implications for the long-term stability and the long-term unity for Libya, and I am talking beyond Islamic State the day after these airstrikes. So yeah.
Sure. Let me bring in Salah Elbakush. You were shaking your head, sir, as you were listening to what Mohammed had to say. And Christopher, I saw you too. I'll come to you in a moment. Salah, what's your disagreement with what Mohammed had to say?
This is completely a partisan analysis of this. The French action and the American action, they are completely dissimilar. You can't say that the French action is the same as the American action. The American action came in response to a request from a government that's recognized internationally, that was born out of a political agreement that Libyan parties worked on for more than a year. You can't compare that with the French action of supporting a renegade general that does not support the internationally recognized government, does not recognize the political agreement that was recognized by the Security Council in its decision of 2259. So that there is no comparison. General Haftar, he's fighting in Benghazi and he doesn't recognize anything. There are no two factions opposed to the GNA. There is one faction that's led by General Haftar and his supporters in Egypt and the Emirates and the French. So these are the facts and everybody knows these.
Okay, before we get too mired in the whole General Haftar issue, which of course is also part of the whole scenario in Libya, let me go back to Christopher. You heard those 2 points of view, Christopher. This is the real problem for the United States and international governments that want to get involved in the Libya issue, is that siding with one side or another, legal or not, is a minefield of its own.
I mean, I think it's something, obviously, the complicated political situation in Libya right now is something that has held the United States and its allies back from taking any kind of action, which is why you're right to pose the question of the timing of these strikes. Why did they take place? Of course, the U.S. has conducted airstrikes in Libya already this year and also last fall against ISIS. But what's different in this case is that it seems to be that these airstrikes are going to be continuous until ISIS is taken care of. And that's a significant step. And then obviously, as we've been talking about, it's also important that the GNA has actually requested these airstrikes. So those are two very significant developments. And I think they're brought about, I think, as Mohammed was saying, by the fact that what we saw was a really very successful push by the government-aligned militias into Sirte over the course of the first initial weeks of that push. But then it really bogged down over the course of the last couple of weeks. And I think that difficulty and the losses that they were suffering has made the situation such that there was almost no alternative for the GNA but to go and request that U.S. support. The question now, of course, is, what's going to happen next? I mean, how can Sirte, after these ISIS fighters are chased out, how can it be restabilized? How can you get the economy re-going? How can the humanitarian aid that needs to be delivered? And how can we help people to return to their homes?
And of course, that all happens if and when you can halt ISIL's operations. Salah, can I bring you in here just to get some background now of what's going on really in terms of Libya for our international viewers who aren't so au fait with the issues of what's going on? Just very quickly, how long do this campaign, do you think, will go on in trying to sort the ISIL issue out in Sirte? Obviously, the government want a very quick, comprehensive attack so they can gain control of Sirte. What's your assessment of the way the government are thinking?
I think the government and actually the military officers in charge of this operation, they expect that the battle will last probably a couple of weeks, if not some days. However, we have to mention, and we have to, I guess, to admit that the end of the Battle of Sirte is not the end of Daesh in Libya. They probably succeeded in conducting an organized retreat for their leadership. and some of their members out of Sirte, probably to the southwest of Libya. And we have to expect or be on the lookout for some operations from Daesh, either targeted against major city centers in the north, or maybe against the south of Tunisia.
Well, of course, Christopher's agreeing, but let me bring in Mohammed here. Of course, there has to be some sort of exit strategy that ISIL would have. They're not just going to sit there and wait for the bombs to arrive.
First of all, let me comment on the point that there is contradiction between what the United States officials are saying and what the Prime Minister said in his televised statement yesterday. The spokesperson for the Pentagon yesterday said, "We will be conducting airstrikes in Libya." He did not specify just Sirte, but said Libya in general. Also, he said we cannot put a time limit on the involvement of the United States against the Islamic State in Libya. On the other hand, the Prime Minister said that the mission is specific to Sirte only and that it is very limited, etc., but he did not specify a time there. So there is a little bit of contradiction there in terms of how the US and the government sees it. In terms of the exit strategy for Islamic State, and this is the important part, the day after is always the most important part. And what we currently have seen from Islamic State is that its members will either choose to join other local extremist groups, such as the case of Darna. When Islamic State was defeated there, some of its members joined the other extremist group, Ansar al-Sharia. Or you have members of these groups getting or sneaking into Libyan cities and towns and then becoming sleeper cells where they would move towards more of the conventional way of conducting terrorist acts or violent acts in Libya and also in the region.
Of course, certainly something to think about. Christopher, can I just bring you in here? Because obviously, with so many fighters still stuck in Sirte for ISIL, and who knows what they might do, the real issue, I suppose, the real issue is that we've seen in both Iraq, in Syria, that aerial bombardment doesn't always work and ground troops are required. In Libya's case, it's even more complicated because of the fractious nature of the political and military scenario there. When I say military, I'm also talking about militias. How do you see that going forward? Because America and its allies can only bomb from the air for so long before there has to be some sort of ground offensive, and a coherent ground offensive where everybody is on the same page.
Well, I mean, we have a ground offensive going on that's led by the militias that have pushed ISIS as far out as it can be. I mean, the real question is, and I think that can succeed with airstrikes. Doesn't mean that it will, but I'm actually far more optimistic about success than I was a few weeks ago. So I think that this is a positive development. And if ISIS can be rid of its safe haven in Sirte, that's a really significant development. But of course, all of the problems that the other two guests were talking about are still there. I mean, just getting ISIS out of Sirte doesn't mean getting it out of Libya. Even if that's a defeat for ISIS, there's still a very significant problem to deal with in that country. So I think we're going to see a long-term U.S. and America's allies trying to work together with Libyan political authorities in order to resolve this problem. Who will be there to do the stabilization in Sirte itself? That's what I was asking before. You definitely are going to need some kind of forces, security forces, that are accepted by the local population. And right now, it's not clear who those are going to be.
Salah, can I bring you in here on, perhaps we just move the conversation now to see how we can develop this, and that according to the authorities, the targets are not US chosen. They are chosen by and been picked out by the GNC. How important is a propaganda message to the public at large in Libya that this is a Libyan controlled offensive and that the international community is helping and that the US is not the problem, the US is not choosing these targets?
Well, this is very important for the GNA to show that it is in control of this operation, that the forces are controlled by the GNA and they work according to its instructions. The operation room has helped, I think, worked closely with the Americans to develop a target list in Sirte. They are on the ground. These are experienced fighters, even though they lack the equipment, but these are experienced fighters. They fought inside the cities before, inside Misrata in 2011, and inside Sirte also late 2011. So I think this is important for the government to show that it is requesting this this help specifically in cooperation with the military people on the ground. And unlike what Mr. Jarrah is saying, the American government is not the one who pushed for this interference and who pushed and who selected the timing. We can recall the incoming chief of the AFRICOM in Libya and his testimony before the Defense Committee of the Senate, where he said that we don't have an overall strategy, and he said also that he does not understand why we're not bombing Daesh and Sirte. Now here comes a request from the operation room through the GNA to the American administration. The American administration has agreed, especially since it helps the Americans, it helps the Libyans, and it helps the international community regain some of the credibility that it lost with the foolish French connection with Haftar.
Well, isn't that the case that Mohamed El-Jar in Tunis, that isn't there a worry that with such sort of Western intervention, the Prime Minister, Siraj, could be accused of furthering Western interests? I mean, that's often the accusation made by Islamist critics of the GNA, and then that adds fuel to the fire.
Mr. Elbakush made an important point here, and I think the United States for a while has been wanting to take action in Libya, but they didn't want to do or take that action because they wanted to give the political process that was led by the UN a chance before they actually take any action. And they did at some point take some unilateral action, but it was very surgical and very limited. But now I think they have managed to get this UN-installed government to give them the consent in order to conduct these operations. Another important point is that the US has personnel, intelligence personnel and military personnel on the ground who are helping the GNA government forces, but they are not combat missions, but rather giving logistical and technical support, etc. I think what's important yesterday in the televised statement is that Prime Minister Sarraj made the announcement before the US officials did, and that gives him ownership over the issue or the whole involvement of the United States. However, that does not absolve him of his opponents who will use this against him, including General Haftar in the east, the head of the internationally recognized parliament in eastern Libya, Aguila Saleh, already spoke out against the US airstrikes, and he said they should have been approved by the internationally recognized House of Representatives. So there is a deep divide here, and that is the problem that I wanted to emphasize, is that the country still does not have a single unified representative government. There are still opponents to this government, even within the capital Tripoli, including the controversial and powerful Grand Mufti, who has been talking that this government is a puppet government, is a Western installed government, and it is a government that is only meant to further the interests of Western countries such as France or the US or other regional players. And I think that's a very tricky situation for Prime Minister Sarraj and his presidential council to be in.
OK, well, we're getting very close to the end of the programme. Let me bring in Christopher here, perhaps for the final comment. And Christopher, this will be the concern for the American administration, the outgoing one, and whichever administration and president comes into power in November after the next election, that they will have to try and work with a very fractious, disunified political system and group of people in Libya. Even if you do get rid of ISIL out of Sirte, there is still a vacuum that has to enable law and order to be achieved in that part of the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think obviously ISIL is a very serious problem that U.S. And European policymakers are very concerned about. But the reality is that, as you say, even if you get rid of ISIL in Libya, you still have a civil war going on that could potentially get even worse than it has been over the course of the last 2 years. And when it comes to the question of interests and U.S. versus Libyan interests, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I mean, I think the interests of the United States, of France, of the U.K., of other important powers is actually to see some kind of stability in Libya, to see the economy get going again, to see people be allowed to return to their homes, because that's the only way that the U.S. interest in getting rid of ISIL is actually going to be able to take hold over the long term. So I actually think that the interests of Libya and the interests of the United States on this issue are very much the same.
Thanks, Christopher. There for the moment, we have to leave it. And thanks to all of our guests on this edition of Inside Story, to Salah Elbakush, to Mohammed El-Jah and Christopher Chivis. And thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at our handle, and that's at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail Rahman, and from the whole team, thanks very much for your time and your company.